I'm going to modify the order in which we present slightly because we'd like to work from the larger scale to the smaller scale in two different geographic areas. We're going to start in Italy, largely, and then move over to America. We've got two presentations, one in each geographic context. The first paper will be presented, we're dealing, of course, with the parish as a whole and the parish church more specifically, but the first paper will be presented by Professor Carla Zito. And after that, the next will be Luigi Bartolomei, and then we will have Professor Mary Purvis and Isabel? Okay, and Isabel Burnett is not listed this morning. And then Mr. Martin Grenfell. I'll just start. We're going to try to be as quick as possible. I'm going to keep us to 20 minutes, and we're going to run a little long if we do that. We're going to run a little long, and we're just going to go right to 12 o'clock, and we'll have to stop because lunch starts then, okay?
Good morning to everybody. I am Carla Zito from Politecnico di Turin. My presentation is about the history of Turin during 1965. From 1965 to 1977, and the title is On the Age of Turin. The church is no longer a monument but house among the houses, poor among the poor. The history of the construction of new parish churches in the city of Turin after the Second Vatican Council represent a little study chapter of sacred architecture in Italy, even if it's crucial in the history of Italian architecture of the second half of the 20th century, due to the presence to Cardinal Michele Pellegrino, active initiator of change within a diocese. Professor of Ancient Christian Literature in the public university since 1948, he was appointed Archbishop of Turin on October of 1965. He participated as an expert and a divisor on religious building strategy in Second Vatican Council on two issues. In 1966, he became a member of the Concilium ad exequendam Constitutionem de Sacra Liturgia. In June 1967, he was created a cardinal and remained in office until 1967, when he resigned prematurely. During the year of Father Michele Pellegrino episcopate, a great number of parish churches were built in the city of Turin and on its outskirts. The city was already partially involved in a process of urban development, which also included examples of sacred architecture. In fact, during the episcopate of Cardinal Maurilio Fossati, from 1930 to 1965, there were a great number of innovative models, both structurally and liturgically. For example, we can see the Church of Santa Teresa, of architect Gianfranco Fasana, Carla Lenti, Giuseppe Baraldo, and Don Pio Zuccotti, which is proposed a pre-conciliar model, where the first project has a centripetal arrangement of plane, totally inspired by modern movement. Another example is the parish church of San Pio X in the district of Falchera, which was designed by Nello Nacco, who also designed the parish facilities in 1965. Equally interesting is Church Gesù Redentore in Fiat Mirafiori district. This was designed by architects Nicola and Leonardo Mosso from 1963 and opened in 1967. With the episcopate of Father Michele Pellegrino, a new chapter opens. He tried to negotiate between the council reforming impulse and social and cultural change that characterized the 16th and 17th in Italy. For this reason, the place of worship had a key role in the liturgy. In fact, the bishop established the diocesan liturgical office in Turin on September of 1966, the first in Italy to be the executive body of the new liturgy. According to article number 44 of Sacrosanctum Concilium, this authority directs the Diocesan Liturgical Commission, with as an advisory status with the task of studying and promoting diocesan liturgy, and is divided into 3 sections: one for pastoral liturgy, one for sacred music, and one for sacred art. In the city of Turin, from 1965 to 1977, 22 parish churches were built, all located in industrial suburbs, where they were most urgently needed. They were very different from the usual religious architecture, because they rose among rows of 8 buildings, and they had no worship elements. We can see some examples. The Church of Maria Madre della Chiesa, dated 1971, designed by architects Luciano Re and Aldo Vaccarleri. To understand the complex relationship between church and houses, there are 2 emblematic cases. The Church of San Luca Evangelista, built as a part of the city plan for Mirafiori Sud district. The project is by architect Mario Federico Ruggero, and it's dated 1967. The Church of Maria Regina delle Missioni, dated 1917 and designed by architects Domenico Mattia and Luco Misturino, which is in an area loaded by 2 high blocks of 8 and 10-story flats. The planning of new church was carried out by a technical department called Turin Churches. This department proposed the detailed plans for financial and technical operation, land acquisition, and relations with the Pontifical Commission for Sacred Art in Italy and other public institutions. Research carried out at Turin Diocese and the Vatican Secret Archive show that this planning was developed in accordance with Italian law. This parish church holds some interest in social history, but have little architectural quality. However, they were emblematic for at least 2 reasons. The liturgical renewal, which was ratified by the Second Vatican Council, found its own space here. These churches were built between over 1,000 difficulties for communities that suffered for a lack of place of worship and a distance from the Catholic hierarchy. On the other hand, the growth of Turin in the 60s and its development forced the city council and church to reconsider the term of the presence of the latter in the city for the construction of a new idea of community space at neighbor level. During the urban situation determined not only the peripheral location of new built churches, but also their large number, as well as urgent planning that characterized that architectural model of buildings of worship. Religious facilities were some of the social service deemed to indispensable in the new residential area. The need for a large number of parish churches highlights two key issues for the city. Lack of the social aggregation, crucial in the residential district, and the drastic reduction of religious practice caused by a mass detachment from Catholic tradition. The so-called Plan 167, adopted and approved by the city of Turin in 1963, provided for the construction of low-cost housing and additional municipal and social service. For that reason, the city bought or expropriated land, including areas originally allocated to religious centers. The plan included 24 areas, whose total surface area amounted to about 6 million square meters. But the population grew more than expected and diluted the implementation of the plan, partially failed, as original intentions were not met. In the suburbs, the absence of a church meant that were nothing there to promote social aggregation, which was especially needed by the population immigrated from the south of Italy, and it also meant a drastic reduction in religious practice. The parish churches had to meet the urgent needs of the community, lending themselves to many uses during the week, except for Sundays, when they only acted as churches. Roberto Gabetti, a famous Italian architect, after 30 years for this building process, in his book Churches for Your Time, How to Build Them, How Do You Know Them, wrote, in the 60s and 70s, the building of new churches was not included in city planning. Places of worship continue to exist in shops, derelict buildings, investments, generally called sottochiesa, awaiting the construction of new churches. This emergency solution represents a strong mark of religious and social experience. Suburban churches, poor churches for unemployment and immigrants are all marks of a deep social and economic crisis. For this reason, the design of the buildings of worship became secondary. Technological innovation and prefabrication helped to build the church quickly. These are no history of a building process that was repeated for more than 20 times in the suburbs of Turin, fitted well with both the reform of church liturgy and the evolution of secular world. Why were these churches similar to warehouse or garage? Because these religious buildings were born as parish facilities for new areas where there were no churches and which were far away from the parish church. Two national laws of 1952 and of 1962 made it possible to build a church of parish facilities with public funding. If a new church was not scheduled, to be built, but was necessary, a prefabricated building could be built. As a consequence, there were a lot of multifunction halls to the celebration of Mass, which were typical of touring disciplines. They were characterized by an analogy, quote, rather than consider the church as a monumental building, today, more than ever, it's important that it comply to the needs of today's faithful. Once the construction area has been identified, a maximum versatility in the use of space must be combined with building in a way that allows a simple and cheap construction, unquote. Here, anti-monumentality, multifunctionality, the choice of areas where to build, and the architectural project are all a part of the same problem. There are two reasons why we have a simplistic adherence to spiritual poverty in these buildings. The morality of a rich monument, of a rich and monumental church in a poor area. The economic problems which favor provisional buildings. The design of a building or worship became insignificant. Therefore, technological innovation contributed to prefabrication, building quickly. These parish facilities use a modular scheme, which is often repeated in Turin. They are characterized by prefabricated reinforced concrete beams resting on two other extremes, which are in turn supported by reinforced concrete pillars. This structure became a church and were no longer a monument, but rather the house among the houses for the Christian community, poor among the poor. This poverty, which is often confused with degradation, it can be in many cases an expression of simplicity and a good relationship with the local community. The new Christian communities composed of a heterogeneous population from different parts of Italy were looking for a place together. They often found places of worship in warehouses or garages, where the sense of the sacred was only made of folklorish symbol of worship, flowers, pictures, and statues of saints and Madonna, just like in the parishes of their own town. These symbols were placed in the building to make beautiful space, which were necessary for and flinted degradation and misery. In the 1971, Cardinal Michele Pellegrino, in paragraph 11 of his Working Together, explained the meaning of poverty in church facilities and said that it means giving exact way to pastoral activity and to community, and not seeking assets that are disproportionate to their head. The analysis of individual cases stresses the importance of giving due weight to the situation of useful service and social organization present or absent in each other. These realities of national interest.
I'll tackle anybody who stays up there 1 minute too long. I'm just kidding. This was just right.
1 minute.
That's okay.
These realities of marginal interest grew with communities after becoming pride of those who helped build them and still contribute to their development. Their foundation was often characterized by an insecurity which is still tangible, because these projects are on land not owned by the parish church, not by Turin diocese. 30 years later, most of the parish complexes rise in areas in which there were construction rights with an expiry date of 99 years. Nevertheless, both from a perspective of urban planning and from liturgical point of view, these parish churches have played a key role in the process of community building in the industrial suburbs independently of their religious character. The development of these facilities did not stop the day of consecration, but continued over the years, showing that although they were born as multi-purpose halls, they have evolved over time without considering the possibility of moving to more conventional premises. Thank you.
I feel terrible when we have to rush folks who've come all this long way to present. But I just want to make sure you have time at the end to discuss, because it is a symposium and we want to make sure you can discuss your points. And I'm sorry. Thank you very much. That was wonderful. Luigi, you want to switch?
Well, I'm Luigi Bartolomei from University of Bologna. I'm teacher of architecture and composition, and I was invited professor in our department of theology in Emilia-Romagna. I apologize for my English. I made by myself translation of my speech. So, 5 years ago, at the Department of Architecture and Territorial Planning of the University of Bologna, Professor Praderio and I decided to embark on an interdisciplinary research and teaching experience specifically dedicated to the study and design of sacred architecture, and therefore to Catholic churches, chapels and graveyard, as per the misleading overlap, which is still dominant in Italian everyday language, despite the spread up of religious indifference, agnosticism, and secularization. The theological department of Emilia-Romagna was soon to get involved in this initiative, bringing about a formal cooperation, which I would like to highlight as being one of the few instances of formal cooperation between an authoritative public educational center and the Catholic Church, since there is no department of theology whatsoever in the Italian system of public universities. First part, I will have 4 little speech about 5 minutes each. So, first part. This activity of design for sacred architecture identified 2 main recurrent crisis points in the contemporary architectural design for Catholic liturgy. The first one is the outer scheme, is on the facades, is at the border with the so-called profane, so it's a relationship with the architecture, sacred architecture, and the churches. The second point is the church interior design, the inner architectural character, and even the position of the liturgical polarities, altar and ambo. The first point, problem of skin. Here you can see one of the last work of Mario Botta. It's not a factory, it's a church. Well, faced with the task of erecting a church for our time, architecture cannot avoid summing up the debates on multiculturalism, religion pluralism, as well as the dynamism of the social scene. So, which architectural preeminence for the church of the contemporary secular? There is in fact a paradox in Europe on which the European towns keep on building themselves. The contemporary town is growing on the same ancient geometry of the historical one. Its center, it's always the cathedral, although the cathedral is not recognized as a spiritual center by all the citizens. The cathedral stays at the heart of the town as a part of the iconic city system, civil seal of membership of every inhabitant without any relation to its original and liturgical meaning. The cathedral binds the citizen to its image, not to its Christian origin. The place of faith, musealized in this way, because of course you know that in church, in Catholic Church, you find all the masterpieces of art. So we have a museum, not more churches, musealized in this way and converted into a simple storage of cultural values promotes the city, but it cannot establish a citizenship. This means that in the physical center, of course, rests the cathedral in its uniqueness, but the spiritual centers are multiplying themselves toward a strong plurality in this world and in the other one. The other one is not the word of God, of course, but the virtual one, the one of internet. In the new multiplicity of urban spaces for religions and spiritual centers, real and virtual, Catholic churches will be recognized as urban centralities only by the community of believers, creating a condition for some respects similar to the one of the pre-Constantinian church, then quickly changed already between the edict of Milan and the one of Thessalonica. The perspective of a weaker church, from the political and social point of view, could be an extraordinary opportunity for architecture to discover again the simple signs of the first Christian community. One fresco of a fish or for a Moscophoros were an ambiguous code to the identification of place, almost invisible to the Gentiles. This syntax of minute signs, independently from their stylistic character, would be a much more proper Christological icon than the ones we saw in the past, like, for example, pinnacles of cathedral, Baroque spros, or even the columns of the Constantinian Basilica. Space, like, for example, Ser de Eusebio di Cesarea, space of majesty and grandeur, image of the royalty of Christ, of course, by means of similarities sometimes too close to the typical forms of the kingships of this world. Point B, problem of self-consciousness, the inner space. The church itself cannot finish, of course, to research in the history its own identity and mission. In particular way, the most recent changes in the structure of the living church reveal the prevailing of a new specification in groups, movement, association, rather than a territorial distribution as the one of the past of parishes or the one of the pievi, that the American soil is too young to have known. The question is, a church for each group, not more a church, a territorial church, but a church for each group. Every group, in fact, wants to belong to the universal church, but also to underline its own charisma and to specialize its liturgy. In some cases, the gestures of the rite modifies the architectural space. In some others, it happens the opposite, and new architectural solutions are invoked to modify the worship, configuring new spaces, sometimes even provisional. Which inner architectural configuration for the contemporary church and for the Catholic liturgy, of course, why? Which one? Which Catholic liturgy, of course? The one of the German experimentation, Communio Raume, the neo-catechumenal way, one with at its center, you can see here, a big banquet table, or last one, the one with the altar approved immediately after the Trento Council, whose liturgical use has been allowed again by the motu proprio Summorum Pontificum. So, It is my use to found the reason of our research at the foundation, so in the Bible. Which church for our time? I try to investigate the Gospels to get help. I summarize my researches with some keywords. First keywords, dismissal. The dismissal of the temple operated by Jesus is a quite common and well-known theological argument, and I don't want to spend too much time on it. Nevertheless, it is interesting to underline that the dismissal of the temple is not simply the pars destruens in Jesus' preaching. The dismissal of the temple is always related with the institution of the new temple, not made by human hands. The abolition of the whole temple is a strong assertion of monotheism, against every sort of idolatry, even against the contemplation of non-durable beauties, like the ones of the temple stone. It is responding to the invitation of our Lord that we should look away from the temple and its architecture, falsely eternal, to contemplate Christ and Christ alone. Then, while the whole preaching of Christus' doctrines is to substitute the temple and to dismiss each sacred places in order to a global purification against idolatry, the historical Jesus, Christus agens, never had a fixed place to stay. Foxes have holes and the birds have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. If one would ask to set the typical space of the public life of Christ, it would certainly be the house, not the temple. The house is the place where Christ is housed, where he founds friends, where he heals the wounded, and where he finally reveals himself not as a guest, but an host. Even when Jesus rails against the soldiers to fight them off the temple, only act of violence and anger made by Christ that is related in the Gospels. He says, "My house will be called a house of prayer for all people," using the Greek word oikos to translate the Hebrew bait, here and there, always not temple, but home. The new religious sphere, it's very important, this is everyday life. And the house is therefore almost a symbol of this field. The reference to a common life dimension is that the fundamental fact that opens the Christian message to a universal vocation. So it's Catholic because of this. This consideration, therefore, is significant also in relation to the limited theme of architecture for Christian churches. They lead to the preference for anti-monumental spaces, where the community could find spaces to pray together, but also to live in the fraternity of the common faith. The church of living stones have always to prevail on the one built with rocks. The site, finally, the only place, already in the Old Testament, is only God himself. Every other place is a common place. If in somewhere we have to stay, of course, is in his love, remain in me. The second word is inadequacy. The second word I want to underline is inadequacy, because every place and every architecture will be substantially and forever inadequate to the ministry it has been built for. The radical inadequacy of the sanctuary to the saint is not only substantial, but also hermeneutical. Not only there isn't any architecture which could be adequate by itself to the church or to Christ, but we will never have even a temple which could interpret by itself all the gospel throughout all its significant structure. The inadequacy is the origin of the necessity of heart. The disproportion between the inevitability of dwelling to which even the church's living body is subject, and the spatial irreducibility of the Christian message lead to an attempt to compensate the constitutive inadequacy of each artifact through the path of symbolic significance. And the Church, as Christ himself, began to speak in parables, using a language of symbols and art, taking advantage of the imperfect adhesion between man and meaning to have wholeness a grace through which see the particular polysemic richness of the Christian message. The Church is, therefore, constitutively favorable to art. But the connection between art and religion is not typical only of the Catholic Church. Even the primitive art was a representation of that mysterious network of participations and mutual dependencies which were supposed to be at the origin of the whole reality. Some symbolic form, as such as, for example, the shape of the cross, are so deeply rooted in the human psyche to assume deep and quite common meanings, backgrounds of the most entrenched structures of our psyche, which more are deep and basic and more lose their individual aspects. It is totally impossible to eradicate them from the form of Christian sacredness. Simple forms, and first, geometric signs, were the palpable traces of the fundamental religious and cognitive psychological structure of every human being, of his own specificity, of a cognitive investigation of reality in which, turning now to the theological point of view, one can recognize the only intimate light which definitely predestinated man to Christ as his fulfillment. Supporting so that the Church, in his architectural configuration, should be essentially determined by the memory of Christ in opposition to the archetypes of the deepest part of our psyche is equivalent to support the partially of the redemption accomplished by Christ. Instead, the same use of archetypal symbols in Christ's preaching should lead to understand that all the human research before him was really to him, to prepare this meeting between man and God in Jesus Christ. From the architectural point of view, this consideration opened to a certain minimalism, as long as it could be useful to put the living church at the center of the architectural space. The liturgical action has to activate the space, the simple line which man has always used to express his existence and its ontological research. Last point. Decus. The space for God, which is always inadequate, must be decorous, proper, exactly in Latin sense, decus, simply what suits, ciò che si addice in italiano. If every architecture will be always inadequate to God and His gospel, this decus is then the measure of the good balance we expect to find between the celebrated sacrament and the new and the men who have to recite it, between the eternity of the eternal presence of God and the fast fleeting time of the mental issues. We are looking for an architecture which could express this balance between divine catabasis and human anabasis, between the eternal and the present, the hic et nunc of every Catholic everyday community. It's because of that we cannot think to find out the unique, holy, ideal church, the only one suitable for every place and every culture. But if, on one end, it is necessary to bring the discussion about sacred architecture on the local contexts, on the other hand, our global culture brings some issues of our time to be common all over the world. Everywhere in Europe, the ancient language of architectural symbols is died. Here I show you some new architecture projected by our students while I finished the conclusions. Yes. Everywhere in Europe, the ancient language of architectural symbol is dying. With the Industrial Revolution, we have lost forever the man who created an entire piece of art, and with the same care, a common object with the wall of himself. The final closing of the potter's house has stolen the place and the act where man could see the innermost essence of his freedom, the foundation of his dignity, being the image and the likeness of God. A new architecture for the Catholic Church that would propose again the use of ancient symbols would be now fully affected to exercise. This doesn't mean we should stop our search at the current minimalism, of course. This decus, which is the measure of priest aesthetic, is not the discipleship of the common caste, but attention to the living church and to the human conditions. Therefore, the fundamental aspect that the church architecture has to offer today to the altar of God is a true interpretation of the 21st century man, of his wood, of his drama, which is very important above all in Europe, maybe the drama of persons who have lost their roots, and looking at the past, they found an irreparable break deeply rooted in our common cognitive and productive habit. A composed atmosphere excluding disorder, speaking dead architectural languages, or taking his refuge in the revival of archaic models made in concrete and steel, false antiquities enable of speech and prophecy, are carnival architectures which have the only reason to proclaim our faith like something of the past and no longer appropriated to our times. The church tradition need to speak the language of our time. This will be possible only starting from a deep understanding of our time, of the contemporary man, starting from a new Catholic science we have lost with the division in different knowledge, in different fields of knowledge. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Next is Mary Cormices from the University of Maryland.
I do want to acknowledge my collaborator, Isabel Gournay. She's not able to be here today. She had a minor surgery yesterday. But while we wrote this paper together, Isabel did the lion's share of the research for this project. So our talk presents an overview of the post-war building campaign of Catholic complexes in Montgomery and Prince George's counties, Maryland. In a period of great dynamism for the Catholic Church, these suburban parish complexes exhibit practicality, fervent piety, and the use of architecture to sustain a rich community life. Although a few complexes were built at once, like those you see here on the screen, far more experienced two distinct phases of construction. First, a utilitarian school group accommodating worship in a multi-purpose space, and second, a monumental church. These expanding parish complexes enhance the identity of a new post-war suburban cohort and serve their multiple functions with practicality and grace. The buildings we studied were site and program specific. They were very down to earth. They ranged from dirt cheap to lavishly decorated. There was no dominant diocesan style. The complexes ranged from traditional to progressive and showed many different characteristics of modernism. I'm going to begin with a brief analysis of the context and process underlying the building of parish complexes. I'll continue with a virtual thematic tour and conclude with an analysis of cultural and aesthetic issues significant to the preservation and heritage of baby boom modernism. 45 churches and religious complexes were built in Montgomery and Prince George's counties between 1949 and 1971. The first suburban pioneers had to attend Mass in places as odd as Quonset huts or a movie theater. Their willingness to invest in subscriptions and communal effort and sweat equity underlay many Catholic building campaigns. St. Bernard's Auditorium School and Convent in Riverdale were built by 153 volunteers working in their spare time. St. Catherine Labouré held dances to repay parishioners for all the hard work they were putting into the church complex. The Archdiocese of Washington, which included D.C., Montgomery and Prince George's counties, and the counties of southern Maryland, must be considered one of the region's principal entrepreneurs sponsoring modern architecture. The Archdiocese closely monitored parochial construction. From 1947 to 1973, it was headed by Patrick A. O'Boyle, a social liberal but a staunch defender of spiritual traditions and papal dictates. Aided by a dynamic team of clerics and local builders as consultants, O'Boyle oversaw the construction of 317 buildings.
Wow.
The Archdiocese began its construction campaign by taking advantage of suburban landscape amenities, selecting sizable property, usually at least a dozen acres on average, in order to accommodate ample parking and school playfields. Land was generally purchased with diocesan funds, but was sometimes donated by religious orders or by developers who found it advantageous to provide or attract communal structures to their suburban neighborhoods. The land chosen was near or adjacent to well-traveled routes and often backed onto privately or publicly owned woodlands. The Archdiocesan Building Commission entrusted parish buildings to a small stable of pre-approved local architects, whose community buildings, as evidenced by these pictures, peppered suburban Maryland. Most of the architects were graduates of Catholic University. Catholic University architecture professor and Dean Paul Gettleman designed 3 of our churches. Johnson and Booten had their hand in many commissions in Montgomery County, as did Walton and Madden in Prince George's County. The top priority of the Archdiocese after World War II was to open a primary school in each parish. According to its education director, this was the only effective weapon against secularism, the denial of God in everyday life. For all post-war suburbanites, schools for young children were key social condensers. With children attending Catholic schools, parish and family lives coalesced. Indeed, Maryland had a strong legacy of Catholic education. In the mid-50s, a vast majority of the state's 17% of non-public school students were in Catholic establishments. By 1955, Montgomery and Prince George's counties each counted nearly 5,000 children in elementary parochial schools, most of them coming from middle-class families. In the mid-1950s, 1/3 of the teachers were nuns. For them, the Archdiocese built convents. Behind discreet, occasionally distinguished facades lay spacious rooms, a parlor, community spaces, a private chapel, and sometimes a music room. A parish hall was built along with or shortly after initial classrooms. With an average seating capacity of 600, it combined the functions of a school gymnasium and cafeteria, secular auditorium, and a provisional worship space. The mixture of religious and secular functions was thought crucial to maintaining a cohesive worship community in the lower density suburbs. These multi-purpose spaces possessed ingenious flexibility. The majority were pretty utilitarian, a few were ennobled by decoration. From the exterior, parish halls were legible volumes, generally the only components of the complex at that time without a flat roof. Rectories were usually contiguous to other parish amenities. They combine domestic and religious purposes, hosting living quarters for 2 or 3 priests and their housekeeper, as well as parlors and parish committee rooms. Earlier examples have a traditional palazzo-style massing, endowing them with a slightly patrician character. 1960s rectories, however, tend to expound the middle-class suburban vernacular to the point of being housed in tract dwellings. The majority of post-war school and parish hall complexes used a modern vocabulary. The trend toward functional and mostly unornamented schools with multi-purpose meeting rooms began at Our Lady of Lourdes in Bethesda, constructed in 1940 and 41, which you see top left. Utilitarian in design, their competition in massing hugged the ground. In fact, the press used the term ranch style to describe some of these buildings. Parochial school design accommodated Catholic pedagogy, advocating a broad basic education. The Archdiocese did not take a cookie-cutter approach to design, however. The massing in each school was always different, and additions were seamlessly done. Parish complexes routinely offered fine exterior detailing, stone accents, careful elaboration of entrance motifs, and nicely worked religious symbols, most prominently, of course, the cross. The design drama was reserved for the second campaign, the much-awaited Real Church. As competition between denominations marked the suburban landscape, church silhouettes had to expound a clear Catholic identity. The churches we studied were not unprecedented, but neither were they mere copies. They exhibited a certain degree of originality while adhering to 2 principal structural types, an inexpensive A-frame system, and then a bit later, steel-framed sanctuaries enclosing much loftier spaces. We begin with the inexpensive A-frame that led to the creation of simple, good-natured, brick-gabled churches with interesting patterns and textures. Some facades supported traditional Catholic iconography in the form of figurative, even realistic sculpture or ornamentation, articulating an extensive narrative program. Artistic elaboration was controlled by the Archdiocesan Sacred Arts Commission. The 2 gabled facades we were showing you present examples of magnified ornamentation meant to be seen from a moving vehicle, as well as frontally. The first rendition of the crucifixion is in stone and stained glass, the other on the right in mosaic. Canopies signified the suburban church's orientation to automobile culture. The one at Our Lady of Lourdes along East-West Highway was intended as a simple drop-off device. But at St. Bernadette, the canopy was used to support the Virgin's apparition in Lourdes. Proud and solid towers were definitive and uplifting symbols in the low-lying suburban landscape. St. Ambrose, top left, has an illuminated bell tower 65 feet high, surmounted by a 15-foot aluminum cross. During the 1960s, the fashion was for lighter and cheaper steeples. At St. Andrew the Apostle, a removable 40-foot steeple of skeletonized steel pipe was indeed removed. As suburban roadways widened, the traditional frontality of churches gave way to 3-dimensional silhouettes. At St. Catherine Labouré, literal billboard imagery expressed itself in stained glass facing the street. St. Mary's in Landover Hill stands by itself, a bit estranged from the rest of the complex. No matter how basic an A-frame on the exterior, interiors provide exalted spaces for worship and meditation. They employ modern vocabularies to achieve their spiritual effects. Wood supports in sleek renditions add tremendous warmth and drama and often materialize lateral circulation. By 1960, A-frame structures gave way to more heroic tectonic expressions for very large rectangular or T-shaped plans, with the altar occupying a more centralized position. Mount Calvary was the first suburban Maryland Catholic church to use steel framing. Several sanctuaries increased their drama by employing concealed lighting. An important manifestation of modernity was the greater attention to the parishioners' well-being, physical as well as spiritual. Capacious narthexes eased ingress and egress and served as an airlock to help keep temperatures more comfortable. Every church provided well-equipped and accessible restrooms and other public amenities, such as telephone booths. At Mount Calvary, a staggered canopy sheltered students and parishioners for processionals. Architects placed the greatest visual and symbolical focus on the altar, whether the centuries-old version at the very end of the sanctuary, or the new, more open altar that modern suburban worshipers often desired. During the later 1960s, the focus on the altar was enhanced through more modern architectural treatments to reflect the new practices for conducting the liturgy as recommended by the Vatican II Council. In 1965, Archbishop Ogoyle authorized priests to hold a few masses facing worshipers. My tour of the interiors concludes with some views of walls of stained glass, generally part of the original design, but occasionally added later. Frequently, the glass is the most remarkable interior feature. It could range from quite modern to more traditional in aesthetics and feeling. Stained glass enables worshipers to transcend their surroundings, which were becoming increasingly mundane and commercial. They confer to the church interior a great spiritual power and provide solace against the world outside. Church buildings were both agents and symbols of the triumph and crisis of suburban Catholicism. By the late 1960s, several forces contributing to a crisis for the church had gathered. Catholic social and service organizations were attracting fewer volunteers. Vandalism and theft on parish grounds made locking church doors between services necessary, and local and regional church hierarchies were sometimes uncertain how to implement the changes brought by Vatican II. There was a widening ideological divide between Catholic leaders and liberal priests and parishioners. Schools were experiencing financial crises as teaching nuns had to be replaced by lay teachers who demanded competitive salaries. And then there was just rampant inflation and rising construction costs in the late 60s and 70s. Then there were challenges associated with the architecture itself. Affluent suburban parishes were accused of having become comfortable retreats from current problems. In April 1968, in the wake of the civil disturbances in Washington, D.C., Patrick O'Boyle called for a moratorium on all new church and school construction in his diocese. Funds were to be diverted to fighting urban poverty and funding social improvement programs such as daycare and affordable housing. Projects fully designed and already contracted, like the rather Spartan single-level St. Nicholas Church in Laurel, which you see here, were allowed to go forward. There, Pastor Kane practiced tremendous economies, fabricating on his own the simple furniture and altar screen designed by architect Jack Sullivan. In more recent years, one or two parishes have demolished their modernist architecture and rebuilt in a more traditional Italian idiom. A case in point is Our Lady of Mercy in Potomac. New worthy priorities included the construction of nonprofit elderly housing on parish property, financed through public-private partnerships. The legacy of the baby boom era presents a quandary. In parishes losing member households, monumental churches seem a little out of step with the times. At St. Ambrose in Cheverly, the current pastor would like to transform the transept of his oversized church into a multi-purpose activity space and music room. Other churches are just bursting at the seams as demographic changes brought large numbers of Catholic immigrants from Central and South America to this area, beginning in the late 1960s. A striking phenomenon is the advent of national ethnic parishes. Parochial schools are providing a more welcoming home for Latino and Latina children, as they did historically for earlier waves of European immigrants. Yet some are facing closure now because of the economic downturn. The clash between white middle-class spirituality and more traditional devotional practices sometimes manifests in decorative preferences. Here, the baptistry of Our Lady of Sorrows, which you see in the lower left, a jewel of modernist simplicity, gained new decor when it was transformed into a chapel, which you see on the right. I'd like to conclude by estimating the architectural and social legacy of baby boom compounds in the Maryland suburbs. Whether constructed in single or successive building campaigns, these complexes provide useful lessons in civic land use. They provide harmonious and scenic layouts and picturesque but functional massing, clearly governed by a concept of economical master planning. By taking such good advantage of suburban natural features and rolling topography of our region, they provide sound examples of situated modernism. Another characteristic feature is the visual unity of the complexes, whether architecturally bold or just utilitarian. Careful and imaginative linking of parts of the complexes via canopies, breezeways, or clusterings contributes to that visual unity. Most of the Catholic compounds are very much pieces of their time, as these examples demonstrate, whether in Camp Springs or Silver Spring. They are compatible with their surrounding neighborhoods. Okay, that's the slide you should have seen. They are prime examples of modern suburban vernacular, part of a larger suburban cultural landscape, right down to the permastone walls. Inside, churches offer high quality and unique examples of craftsmanship, and they maintain a high degree of integrity. Where there have been recent changes, they are usually architecturally compatible and well-informed additions. At St. Columba, for example, the sanctuary was reoriented and enhanced with beautiful woodwork. At St. Matthias, beams were painted a lighter shade, cinder blocks were stuccoed and painted, and the stations of the cross were remounted. We found these complexes perfectly maintained, user-friendly, and to all appearances integral to the lives of parish families. These compounds still serve their constituencies, and the schools feed life into the church. In short, Catholic parochial complexes in the baby boom suburbs carry a significant legacy deserving documentation, public awareness, and preservation. They provide an important chapter in the history of vernacular modernism in both the Washington suburban region and the state of Maryland. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Heath. That was a very good overview of what I'm going to talk about as a specific and perhaps in a little more depth on one church. The parish church as the heart of community. For the past half century or more, Catholicism, as Catholic life, has suffered a devastating combination punch. One blow from suburban sprawl, and the other from her abandonment of her architectural tradition, arguably the world's oldest continuous artistic tradition. Sprawl has subjected her parishioners to a rootless anomie, and rejecting the sure guide of tradition has condemned them to worship spaces generally comfortless, uninspiring, and usually ill-suited to the liturgy. The purpose of this talk is to show how community can become more integral to contemporary American parish life, or more accurately, how community can once again become integral to parish life. Having practiced traditional architecture and urbanism for a third of a century, I've come to believe that most good ideas are not new, and such is certainly the case here, since prior to the 1950s, parish life was routinely centered in neighborhoods, and as such, enjoyed the rich community life intrinsic to this traditional settlement pattern. But the post-World War II drive towards automobile-dependent suburbs emptied the old urban neighborhoods with their embedded parish churches and offered suburban sprawl rather than neighborhoods as a substitute. Churches bereft of their historical and natural home, the neighborhood, settled instead along traffic arterials, surrounded by great expanses of parking and bargain basement real estate for their future expansion or parking requirements. But times have changed. With the end of cheap oil and the systemic inadequacy of suburban sprawl becoming increasingly unbearable, the older traditional model of the parish church at the center of parish neighborhoods seems eminently sensible and desirable. But in an era of reduced financial resources, a situation arguably the partial result of sprawl, the question might well be asked, how do we get there from here? This case study I present today attempts to show one way to answer this question. The project began when my then employee, Eric Bootsma, who is in the room here today, who presented at the symposium yesterday, happened to worship one Sunday at St. John the Beloved in the Diocese of Northern Virginia. His Monday morning, not very flattering description of the 1950s church and parish school campus was quickly verified upon examination via Google Earth. Yet St. John held a perverse fascination for me. It seemed an ideal prospect for a retrofit case study due to two characteristics. One, its location in an urbanizing first-ring suburb, i.e. 1940s to 1950s vintage. And two, a failed architectural experiment for a church. There are sadly perhaps hundreds of Catholic churches across the nation that share these two salient characteristics. Therefore happily giving this case study a widespread applicability. The site, The site is in a residential monoculture, essentially, yet at this intersection of two major arterials. Let me see, I have a arrow here somewhere. I see it. Sorry, this mouse is sort of, I don't have a pad for it, so I think it's not real happy. It's all rolling around on this.
Just walk over and point. We use the high-tech solution of this.
Yeah, okay. So what we have here is this is the intersection of some major roads. Let's see, they do have bus service. Let's see, one thing about the site with the first-ring suburbs that's particularly interesting to new urbanists such as myself is that there are several things going on here. Due to its proximity to Washington, land values have steadily risen, making the urbanization of the site economically reasonable and really sort of a natural step in the organic growth of the city. The campus is composed of an original 19th century church, and that is this little building here. A 1950s current church, which is here. A parsonage, which is here. A sprawling single-story parish school, which is all of this and all of this. And lots of parking, and lots of just sort of leftover bits of land. So, going to the back of this slide, this is actually the front entrance to the church. You'll note the attempted steeple, the steel pipes here. These are standing under columns. These steel drain pipes. But thank heavens, there's this decorative touch here of the yellow ramp, because else you wouldn't know it was the entrance. Oh, thank you. Very good. The first one, very good. So there's that very useful bit of decoration. And of course, you had to have this sort of thing because the central plan and the want of any architectural language or any traditional devices that are used to signify and celebrate an entrance are not at the disposal of the architect here. So they're reduced to rather basic means of getting you in the building. Let's see, here are some of the generous driveways. And you'll see the bits of leftover land that are scattered about. And you'll notice that the buildings are non-typological. The problem with that is you don't really know that's a church. So thank goodness there's a nice big sign here to clue the uninformed. You'll notice that there's a tremendous amount of landscaping that, of course, requires extensive maintenance. This is a door, which you can tell it's not the front because there's not the decorated ramp, but that's one of the exits, I guess, to the church. Now, not content with hundreds of square feet of roof resulting from its being all on one floor, the school, which we're looking at now, builds this enormous roof canopied entry pavilion that to accommodate all the pickup and drop-off of the students, all of which really have to arrive by car. This is the gym of the school and some classrooms to the left of it. Built to suburban standards, there's really appears to be a superfluity of parking lot to maintain both the church and the school. This excess is particularly wasteful in this case, since the uses of the school and the church seldom overlap in time, and they could easily have been shared. But they were following, I'm sure, the letter of the zoning law at that time, which you had to provide parking for both, as if they were both happening at the same time in maximum capacity. So there's enough room here for heliports and whatnot, but it's total waste, and of course it has to be maintained. This is the original chapel, which has been rather unsympathetically gussied up to look like some sort of suburban mansion. I'm not sure what it's used for now, but it's not particularly attractive. Offices? Mm. Yeah. Well, there's a good view across one of the many parking lots. And the parsonage, pride of place, goes to the garage. Given the architectural prominence of this structure, a Catholic from outer space might mistake the garage for confessionals. Whatever is to be done with so much land to decorate and maintain, it taxes the landscape architect's imagination. This automobile-centric nature of the complex forces the church to have its long entrance canopy for pickup and delivery, such as the school had. The flat roof on the pipe columns is reminiscent of the drive-in diners of the era, truly an architecture of its time. An extensive driveway network with widths apparently to interstate highway standards accommodates cars very graciously indeed. And here's the site again. So for our first move, we decided to establish a street grid and a block structure, traditional sized. The utilities will go in under the street and sidewalks, planting strips with street trees. And note that all these have been laid in onto the site so to avoid taking out any of the existing buildings. Also, we propose tying our streets into the existing residential streets. Because the way it is now, to worship at this church, if you lived here, you'd have to either walk or get in a car and come all the way around to the church. So we just, pop through. In the next phase, two or three-story commercial buildings are built along the traffic arterial, and rent revenue from these will help to pay for the infrastructure that's been put in back here. In the next phase, we build 12 townhouses, the sale of which would help generate more revenue to pay off the infrastructure loans. In the next phase, we add 8 more townhouses on a second block. Note that up to this point, we've not removed any existing buildings, thus avoiding the disruption and the cost of demolition. In phase 5, we break ground on a 3-story portion of a new school building. When completed, this compact building will have the equivalent area of the existing single-story building. No longer needed, this one-story building can be replaced by 28 row houses, an additional cross street put in, and some commercial at the end of the block to complete it. Incidentally, one of the earlier slides showed a phenomenon that's starting to happen in the suburban campuses, is they're putting in elderly housing. We urbanists believe in, we don't like that, of warehousing old folks. We actually believe that they should be part of an active living community, as they always historically been, and the benefit of the young and the old. So the thought is the church could own some of the, retain some of these units, rather than rent them out or sell them, and use them for elderly parishioners. With the revenue from the build-out today, the parish might now be in position to replace the old gym and classroom wing with building fabric, which helps define a handsome and useful courtyard and would accommodate an expanded building program should the demand call for it. There's the gym, and there's even more building if the school needs the space. With the revenue flowing into the parish coffers from land now put to productive use, a proper parsonage and a garden can be built. There's the parsonage, and there's the garden. For the delight of the priests, the parish, and the newborn neighborhood. Now that the priests are properly housed, the new church can be built atop a former residence and garage. Still haven't taken out the old church. The original 19th century church should be restored to serve as a chapel and reconsecrated as sacred space. Let this souvenir from the parish's beginning be restored to its original dignity in honor of the saints that went before, who founded and built this parish. In the 10th phase, final 2 streets are put in, with these creating a square to embellish and honor the west front of the eastern-oriented church. So the west front faces the square. The final phase builds out the north face of the southernmost block with 2 or 3 stories of commercial above and retail below. And this will all enliven the square. Additional parking, and incidentally, that was something that Alberti had alluded to, that the church should be on an active square, and that's exactly what this accomplishes. Incidentally, it's the highest point of Lammen too, which Alberti also said the church should be on. Additional parking is put in the residual space of the block's interior. This could be structured parking if need dictates, that is to say, multiple layers. The completed project is now shown in its context. And then here's aerial view of the site, okay? And this is the aerial perspective rendering of the site. Note that we have not encroached on the school's playing fields to the north. Also note that the church is properly situated on the highest point of the site, which with its large size and tall steeple allows it to dominate the landscape and be visible for miles around. The parish community nestles around her like chicks to a mother hen. It is an orderly relationship with the built environment, as old as Christianity itself. Now for a few vignettes to convey some of the character of this parish village. That would be the commercial frontage along the main thoroughfare. You turn the corner, and there would be your row houses and more shops in here. That's the school with its quadrangle. And surely a school so beautifully wrought, and Eric did a great job of defining this, would really, I think, attract students and grow its endowment. I think it would be a place one would be proud to be associated with. Here you can see the parsonage garden. What it does, it makes a wonderful counterpoint to the public square. The garden here, of course, is private, but you can look into it. And it offers a domestic garden, a private garden in the neighborhood. And it's a pleasant kind of counterpoint to the grander, more civic garden with perhaps St. John, a tall column. The dramatic approach to the square, that's the dramatic approach to the square, I'll go back a minute, up this hill, right here, there's a street in here, put in, would be lined with shops, and would be very, very a splendid thing. You sort of rise, and then you hit this plateau at the top of the hill, and it would really look to your right into the westward of the church. It would be really a wonderful procession from that direction. This is the chapel in its current condition, and this is what we're proposing doing. And you notice it too will have a portico added, which will be a wonderful sort of indoor-outdoor room onto the parish garden, which is just adjacent to the priest's garden, the parsonage garden. And it will be a wonderful outdoor space for the parish life. Just a little plan view. You can see its connection to the restored chapel here.